Welcome to our show. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of rocketry and its pioneers. We have an expert with us who's going to take us through this incredible journey. So let's start with Robert Goddard. What can you tell us about his early work and the skepticism he faced?
Thanks for having me. Robert Goddard was truly a visionary in the field of rocketry. In the early 20th century, he wrote an article for the Smithsonian Institution about lunar exploration. But here's the kicker. Most people at the time thought he was nuts. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that rockets could work in space.
Wait, really? Why couldn't they believe it?
Well, it's pretty wild when you think about it. Most folks back then believed rockets needed air to push against to move forward. Goddard knew better, though. He'd actually done experiments as early as 1909 using a vacuum tube to prove rockets could work in space. In 1924, he wrote a detailed article explaining why, but people just couldn't grasp it.
That's incredible. So what was the main issue people had with understanding rocket thrust?
Great question. You see, people's understanding of thrust came from everyday experiences, like running on the ground or seeing propellers push against air. They couldn't imagine how something could move forward in space without anything to push against. Goddard had to explain it using Newton's laws of motion. You know, the whole for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction thing.
I remember that from school. But how does that apply to rockets?
Well, it's all about the conservation of momentum. The key thing people missed was the mass of the gases coming out of the rocket. These gases might seem insignificant, but they have weight and momentum. When you eject them in large quantities at high speeds, you get a substantial reactive force pushing the rocket forward.
That makes sense when you explain it like that. It's fascinating how something we take for granted now was so hard to understand back then.
Exactly. And remember, back then, people had no concept of jet propulsion. We're used to seeing jet planes and rocket launches now, but in Goddard's time, this was all new and mind-boggling stuff.
Speaking of new stuff, I heard there was some drama with the Wright Brothers and the U.S. aviation industry. Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, absolutely. This is a great story. So, World War I was a wake-up call for the U.S. They suddenly realized that European aircraft technology had zoomed past their own, even though the airplane was an American invention.
How did that happen?
Well, it's kind of ironic. The Wright brothers, bless their hearts, had these really broad patent applications. They were pretty protective of their technology and didn't want to share. At first, they were charging a whopping 20% patent fee for each aircraft.
Wow, that's steep.
You bet. They eventually knocked it down to 2% after a lot of negotiation, but the damage was done. It really held back the growth of the U.S. aviation industry. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Wright brothers' patents didn't have much impact, so European countries were free to advance their aircraft tech. The U.S. was left playing catch-up as they prepared to enter the war.
That's quite a turn of events. So while all this was happening with airplanes, what was going on with rockets?
Well, that's the thing. Rockets were pretty much ignored in the U.S. at the time. Most people didn't see much potential in them. But thankfully, we had Robert Goddard and a small group of dedicated folks who kept plugging away at rocketry. Their persistence is why the U.S. eventually became a pioneer in rocket technology.
That's amazing. Can you tell us more about Goddard's experiments? I heard he had some interesting locations for his work.
Oh, you bet. Goddard faced quite a challenge finding suitable spots for his rocket experiments. I mean, you can't exactly fire off rockets on a university campus, right? He ended up settling on his aunt's garden in the countryside. It's actually a pretty funny story. His aunt lived alone with a bunch of cats, and she loved the excitement Goddard's experiments brought to her quiet life.
That's hilarious. I can just imagine the cats' reactions to the rocket launches.
Right? The local firefighters weren't as thrilled about the frequent explosions, though. But Goddard kept at it. In 1923, he created the world's first liquid-fueled rocket using liquid oxygen and gasoline. By 1925, he was doing static tests, and in 1926, he launched his first rocket test right there in his aunt's garden in Auburn, Massachusetts.
How did that first launch go?
Well, by today's standards, it might not sound too impressive. The flight lasted only 2.5 seconds, reached a height of about 41 feet, and traveled about 184 feet. But remember, this was a liquid-fueled rocket, a complete game-changer. That launch site later became a U.S. National Historic Landmark.
That's incredible progress in such a short time. Did Goddard continue his work there?
He did for a while. He kept testing and improving his rockets, even developing one with a barometer in 1929. But as his rockets flew higher and farther, his aunt's garden became too small. Plus, the neighbors were getting tired of feeling like they were under constant missile attacks.
I can imagine. So what did Goddard do?
Well, he needed to find a new location and set up a new lab, which required a lot of money. Unfortunately, his search for investors coincided with the 1929 Great Depression. Talk about bad timing. It looked like his rocket research might come to an end.
Oh no, what happened?
Here's where it gets interesting. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator who made the first solo transatlantic flight, took an interest in Goddard's work. He believed propeller-driven aircraft would eventually be replaced by jet propulsion and saw potential in Goddard's research.
That's quite a stroke of luck.
It sure was. Through Lindbergh's connections, Goddard was introduced to the wealthy Guggenheim family. They were known for supporting aviation and modern art, and they provided Goddard with a $50,000 grant. Over time, their total investment reached $100,000. That's about $1.7 million in today's money.
Wow, that's a significant investment. What did Goddard do with the funding?
It allowed him to relocate his research to a spacious area in Roswell, New Mexico. Yep, the same Roswell that would later become famous for an alleged UFO incident. But in 1930, it was just a quiet, isolated location perfect for Goddard's experiments.
That's fascinating. How did Goddard's work progress in Roswell?
From 1930 until his death in 1945, Goddard conducted 31 rocket launch experiments there. But here's the thing. Despite all his efforts, his rockets never reached altitudes higher than 2.7 kilometers. To put that in perspective, airplanes of the time could fly up to 15,000 meters, and balloons could ascend to 22,000 meters.
That doesn't sound very impressive. Was Goddard's work not as groundbreaking as we thought?
Well, it's important to understand the context. Goddard was working mostly alone and was reluctant to share his findings. Meanwhile, unknown to him, Germany and the Soviet Union were making significant strides in rocketry. By 1941, Germany's A-4 rocket had reached an altitude of 84 kilometers, nearly touching the edge of the atmosphere.
Wow, that's quite a difference. How did the U.S. government react to all this?
That's the frustrating part. They showed little interest in rocket research. They even reassigned some of Goddard's assistants in 1941. It's ironic because both the Soviet Union and Germany recognized the potential of Goddard's work and even sent spies to gather intelligence on his research.
That's incredible. What happened to Goddard in the end?
Sadly, Goddard passed away from cancer in 1945, never witnessing a rocket reach space. His friend Charles Lindbergh lived to see the launch of America's first artificial satellite, though. It wasn't until 1961 that Goddard's widow made public his 30 years of manuscripts. By then, Yuri Gagarin had already ventured into space.
That's quite a legacy. Did Goddard ever receive recognition for his work?
He did, but mostly posthumously. NASA named the Goddard Space Flight Center in his honor, which now manages the Hubble Space Telescope. And get this, on July 17, 1969, the New York Times published a small article apologizing to Goddard. They retracted their earlier mockery of his work, acknowledging that rockets can indeed function in a vacuum.
Talk about a delayed apology. That's quite a story. Now, I understand there was another important figure in early rocketry, Hermann Oberth. Can you tell us about him?
Absolutely. Hermann Oberth is another fascinating character in the history of rocketry. He was born in Romania under Austro-Hungarian rule and, like many others, was inspired by Jules Verne's science fiction. He was particularly fascinated by From the Earth to the Moon, but he realized that rockets, not cannons, were the key to space travel.
That's interesting. How did he become a rocket scientist?
Well, his path was pretty unconventional. He actually started out studying medicine in university, but his passion was always rocketry. Even during World War I, while serving on the Eastern Front, he was designing rockets. In 1917, he even submitted a liquid-fueled rocket design to the German Minister of War, though it was ignored.
Wow, talk about dedication. What happened after the war?
After the war, Oberth shifted to studying physics in Germany. Here's where it gets interesting. His doctoral thesis on rockets was initially rejected for being too speculative, but Oberth wasn't one to give up easily. He self-published his work and even critiqued the German education system. Eventually, his persistence paid off, and he was awarded his doctorate based on the same unaltered thesis.
That's quite a journey. What did Oberth do next?
He became a member of the German Society for Space Travel, a group of rocket enthusiasts. He published several books popularizing space travel concepts, which influenced many people. But here's where it gets really cool. He was hired as a scientific advisor for a science fiction film called The Woman in the Moon.
A rocket scientist working on a movie? That's unexpected.
Right? And he made the most of it. Oberth proposed building a real rocket to launch at the film's premiere as a publicity stunt. He also designed the rocket's appearance for the film. But his most lasting contribution from this experience was probably the countdown sequence he invented for the film's rocket launch scene.
The countdown? You mean the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 blast-off thing?
Exactly. Oberth came up with that for the movie, and it was so effective that it became the standard countdown procedure for all real-world rocket launches after that. Talk about life imitating art.
That's incredible. Did the film help generate interest in rocketry?
It sure did. The film's premiere was a big deal, attracting high-ranking officials and dignitaries. This publicity helped generate government interest in rocket research in Germany, largely thanks to Oberth's promotional efforts. Although he couldn't complete a real rocket in time for the premiere as he'd hoped, the film still succeeded in inspiring a new generation of rocket enthusiasts.
Fascinating. What did Oberth do after his work on the film?
Oberth continued his work at the Technical University of Berlin, where he researched liquid-fueled rocket engines. It was here that he took on an 18-year-old assistant who would later become quite famous, Wernher von Braun.
Oh, that name sounds familiar. Wasn't he involved in the U.S. space program?
That's right. But before that, during the Nazi era, Oberth participated in rocket research, focusing on solid-fuel rockets for anti-aircraft purposes. This work actually established him as a pioneer in modern anti-aircraft missile technology, influencing the development of systems like the Patriot and Russia's S-300 and S-400.
Interesting. What happened to Oberth after World War II?
After the war, Oberth faced some scrutiny for his work with the Nazis and was briefly detained in the United States. But after his release, he worked as a consultant for various rocket programs, including Italy's space program and the U.S. Atlas and Titan rocket projects. He even contributed to the Apollo program, which allowed him to witness the moon landing he had long dreamed of.
That's amazing. So Oberth lived to see his dreams become reality?
He sure did. In fact, Oberth lived to see both the triumphs and tragedies of the space age, including the Challenger space shuttle disaster. He was the only rocket pioneer to live well into the space age, passing away at the age of 95.
Wow, what an incredible life. It's amazing how quickly rocketry developed from these early pioneers to manned spaceflight.
Absolutely. The rapid development of rocketry from primitive designs to manned spaceflight was largely due to the national efforts of major powers like the Soviet Union and Germany. Interestingly, in Europe, much of the rocket manufacturing was carried out by prisoners, which is a rather dark aspect of rocket history that isn't often discussed.
That's certainly a sobering note to end on. Thank you so much for sharing all this fascinating information about the history of rocketry and its pioneers. It's been an incredible journey through time.
It's been my pleasure. The history of rocketry is full of fascinating stories, brilliant minds, and incredible achievements. It just goes to show how far human ingenuity and perseverance can take us, from Goddard's ants' garden all the way to the moon and beyond.